Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mark Weatherford, and I am the moderator for this panel today, New Options for Better Supply Chain Cybersecurity. And I'm joined today by three distinguished guests: Jennifer Bisceglie, CEO and founder of Interos; Chris Blass, the Global Director for Information Security at Unisys; and Tom Ulrich from Tom Ulrich Consultants. I am going to begin today by just asking each of the panelists to take 60 seconds or so to introduce themselves, tell a little bit about their company and what they do there, and then we'll jump right into some questions. Let's start with you, Jennifer.
Sure. Thanks for having me, Mark. Jennifer Bisceglie, CEO and founder of Interos. We have a artificial intelligence platform that leverages big data and works with organizations to do map, monitor, and model their global supply chains across multiple tiers and multiple risk factors every single day. We look at everything from financial risk to operational risk to cyber risk. And we've suddenly become an enterprise discussion based on the recent attacks of the last 14 months, if you will, everything from COVID to SolarWinds to the trade wars, and then most recently to the Suez Canal. So really excited to be here and looking forward to the discussion.
Thanks, Jennifer. Chris?
I'm Chris Blask. I focus on applied innovation at Unisys. The digital bill of materials was an idea that developed inside Unisys about 2 years ago. So I've been shepherding that forward with open source code and a nonprofit consortium in the Linux Foundation. And I'm looking forward to the conversation as well.
Thanks, Chris. Tom?
Tom Ulrich. I'm a consultant to the electric power industry and vendors to the electric power industry for NERC CIP compliance, as well as more generally for supply chain cybersecurity now. And I've been especially focusing a lot on SBOMs, software bills of material recently, and have been very involved with the SBOM effort run by the National Technology and Information Administration. So looking forward to our discussion today.
Thanks, Tom. So for the audience, in case you haven't guessed, we're going to talk about three things today. And they're all going to, by the time you leave, you're going to understand the relationships between supply chain risk management, digital bill of materials, and software bill of materials. So each of these panelists have their own area of expertise, and we're going to dig into all of these things. So let's start with you, Jennifer. And, we've talked about, supply chain risk management forever. It's a well-defined discipline, but supply chain risk management in 2021 is different than supply chain risk management in the 1900s. So can you tell us how it's evolved from this manual, time-consuming, backward-looking approaches, and just how do we get where we are today with supply chain risk management?
Yeah, well, I think the simplest answer is simply the evolution of technology. If you take it all the way back to the 1900s, which was a while ago, but it was very manual. To your point, it was very human, and that's because that was who was in control. And now you have technology that's shaking hands between suppliers and providers and transporters, raw material providers, all the way to the final goods. And technology has really revolutionized everything. And I think that's really the answer. I think that because of that, the concept of cyber risk, which I know we're going to be talking about as well, has become a critical issue for supply chains. And if you look at the situation that just happened with SolarWinds and the effect on the reputation of businesses that were included, this is kind of a worst case scenario for the C-level executives, which I think is the other big change, Mark. Because of technology and technology being so pervasive throughout our lives, you cannot separate that from your day-to-day business dealings. And for the first time in my career, and I've been in the global supply chain and supply chain risk industry for well over 20 years, this is a C-suite board level conversation in a way that never has been before. And I think, the last 14 months, if you could kind of rewind it just that far, as I mentioned, you had COVID that one showed us not only did we not know who we were reliant on and connected to in our supply chain, but whether that was a good or a bad thing. And the concentration risk, whether it be the PPE concerns or it be the consumer electronics coming out of China or the drugs coming out of India, we just found out that we were reliant on companies and countries around the world that we had no idea what that looked like. And then you have the ongoing trade wars with China that aren't going away anytime real soon. And then you had SolarWinds, where you had a good friend, mentor, and investor in Interos, the CEO of FireEye, Kevin Mandia, that literally went on Face the Nation and said SolarWinds was an attack of the American supply chain. And so I think, to your point and to your question, it's really the advent and just the pace of technology, and technology being so pervasive through our lives, both personally and professionally, that has totally changed the conversation and the cultural shift around supply chain.
Beautiful. I could not agree more. It's just, even as you said, rewind just 14 months, the conversations we have about supply chain today are so different than they were just a year ago.
Yep.
So Tom, everybody, SBOM is like the term du jour. Legislators are talking about SBOM now. But I fancy that very few of them really understand what SBOM is. Why don't you enlighten us? Tell us a little bit about what the Software Bill of Materials initiative is all about.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Modern software development depends heavily on use of pre-written components. I mean, everyone uses them, and they use them because they save the developer just a huge amount of time versus creating all the code from scratch. And SBOM is at heart a list of all the components in a software product. So one study last year concluded that the average software product contains over 100 components, and some of the products include thousands of components. Because each of these components can have its own vulnerabilities, these need to be tracked and remediated just like vulnerabilities in the code the developer themselves wrote. Well, you can't do that unless you know what the components are. And so an SBOM tells you what the components are. But even then, in most cases, a simple list of the components just isn't enough. If your organization uses multiple software products and they each include over 100 components, you'll quickly realize that you need to track these components using automated processes. This means you need to receive your SBOM in a machine-readable format. And then this can be an input into your existing processes for vulnerability management, configuration management, et cetera. There are three primary SBOM formats in use today: SPDX, CycloneDX, and SWID, SWID. They're all available both in machine readable and human readable formats. So,
well, it doesn't take very long to make your head explode when you think about the permutations of all these hundreds of different modules and subroutines and subcomponents in a piece of software, and of all the software we have within our organization. So we'll get more. I have some really hard questions for you here in a minute. So Chris,
okay.
Chris, why don't you kind of put a bow around this thing and talk about the digital bill of materials, and really, I think, summarize what is the difference between an SBOM and a DBOM?
Sure. I think the explanation fits well with what Jennifer and Tom just said, because again, we have a lot of converging threads, and the DBOM evolved. You can track it back to 2018, and a crowd like us, critical infrastructure folks, talking about this, that there's no supply chain visibility. You can't say what's inside anything. And early 2019, with Mehdi Antasari, who can't be here today, the conversation of, can't we just write this down? Can we create a digital bill of materials? We're a big company. We buy from and sell to big companies. And we're the folks inside these companies that know how this works. And the answer is yes. So that digital bill of materials is a stack of attestations, is a stack of information about a thing. And as Tom said, software bill of materials, you have to have that. What's the contents of this piece of software? Another interesting thread evolving at the same time is software custody. A lot of the major banks and major solution providers in the world have been working with a project called InToto that creates attestations about who touched the software in development, so your CI/CD pipeline can be attested to. So as we looked at it, we had to create an attestation infrastructure, and which leads us to the DBOM Consortium, the Linux Foundation project launching this year, the DBOM node code on open source, on GitHub that we open sourced, because no company is big enough to do this. We have to have a standardized way to replace all the faxes and emails and spreadsheets and SharePoints where all of this information is being scattered, and have a repeatable ecosystem where organizations can just choose to share attestations with each other, software bill of materials. If you want that to go to someone or you don't want to go to someone, it needs to be in a place, in a format that allows us to achieve our roles. We don't have 6 days and 6 weeks to respond. These are not internet times. So that's the concept of a DBOM, but the infrastructure of the DBOM that you'll hear about is really just an attestation infrastructure for sharing information about supply chain activities.
So can you maybe distinguish a little bit further the difference between that DBOM and the SBOM?
Sure. So a SBOM is an attestation. It's some company, maybe the vendor of the software, who's saying, here's what we put inside it. It could be a third party who's looked at software, decompiled it in partnership with a vendor or separately, who's making an attestation about the contents of an artifact, in this case, a piece of software. The digital bill of materials architecture is a way to create the repositories, the channels that these attestations can be shared in the way intended by the parties involved. So a software vendor like Unisys can create a channel where we share information about our OS 2400 operating system that underlies our major financial customer systems, that they can see and they can act on. It's not on our website. It's not something you emailed or got in your Dropbox, but it's an official channel where everybody can see where things have been put and where the access to that information can be managed by the nodes, by the gateways to the attestation ecosystem.
Okay, thanks. It's still a little bit confusing, but I know we're gonna get a little bit clearer as we go through this. So Jennifer, let's go back to you on this. You mentioned SolarWinds a second ago. I think it's certainly one of the catalysts for a lot of the activity we see around supply chain. So why have these kind of supply chain cybersecurity challenges become more of a critical issue for C-suites, like you mentioned, and not just for the CISO? We have long lived in this world where the CEO said, "My security guy handles that." That's no longer the case. Talk to us a little bit about that.
Well, I think because, Apple missed its earnings when COVID hit, right? That's not a CISO problem. That's a CEO and a board level problem, because a ship just got stuck that, stopped freight, and it could drive fuel prices up, and it stopped textiles and spare parts from getting where they needed to get to. That's a CEO problem. That's not a CISO problem. And I think what we've rapidly seen, and again, it's been coming, to your point, a lot of people have been talking about it, but I think when you have a crisis like COVID, that I think everybody on this panel and watching, no one would have predicted it would be this long, that we were all still stuck at home doing work from home activities. And, it's making people miss their earnings. It's keeping, and it also became very personal, Mark. So for the first time, supply chain is very, very personal. When I can't get toilet paper and paper towels, that's a problem. And that's the first time, I keep going back to my career, but it's the first time in my career that, my mother actually knows what I do, because it actually impacted her in her own home. Right. And that's a real thing. And then when the ship got stuck, again, there was a lot of textiles on there. So now this is clothing and things like that. Now you can't dress your kids and your grandkids. And so, when things like that happen, so much of this, whether it be SolarWinds, which is, everybody thinks cyber is a thing, and cyber to me is just an access point. It's an access and an opportunity point for business to business to have harm potentially. But you have a situation where now it's actually affecting my brand and my reputation. And that's 100% why it becomes a C-suite and a CEO problem. The other thing that's interesting about it, as the definition of supply chain has been changed very, very quickly. Whereas, to your point, it very much erode the coattails of cyber for many years, because what cyber taught us a couple things. It taught us it's not the company I know I'm connected to. It's the companies they're connected to that caused the problem. So it's the unknown connection and the unknown risk. It also very much brought to the forefront, you can't do this once a year. It's got to be done in a fashion of continuous monitoring. And so the CISOs have always been the ones to adopt this first. But I'll be honest with you, over the last year, the conversation goes from the CISO saying, yes, this is my problem to bring in, to saying, this is really not my problem to solve, but I can move fast. So we're going to get you in here, and then we're going to move you over to procurement or the general counsel or the chief risk officer. And it's because the CEO is now being held accountable. I think, the thing to think about is when COVID hit, when we look at normally how we do supply chain onboarding of vendors, we ask the vendors for the last 3 years of financials. We ask what the bigger customers are for references and capacity. And nothing in the last 3 years of financials could ever have predicted how your suppliers would have acted based on COVID and the breakdown that occurred. And so I think this became very personal. It became very, tactical. This is risk management 101. And it literally became a brand and reputational concern, which immediately put it on the CEO and the board level's desk.
Thanks. So Chris, leveraging off of that, let's talk about data. How does all the supply chain data, it's everywhere and we have lots of it, but how does this get shared today in an efficient fashion? And how can this kind of information be made available to, the millions of stakeholders that need to see it, but without giving away your IP?
Exactly. And the keyword there was efficient. Because to be clear, these systems are very efficient now. We have advanced procurement systems that work with our partners, and working through this with the DBOM consortium. What I like are cases that aren't just about software bill of materials, where someone's using a machine tool that has software in it. So there's a software bill of materials about that, but there's also steel and there's information from the foundry and so forth. And you'll find as you walk through these scenarios with all the stakeholders of people actually doing these things today, and not just making the cybers or security, but to Jennifer's point, delivering the things that we use every day, you find out that the methods they're using include literally the fax machine is one of the big use cases for fax still is in supply chain. That there's emails, there's spreadsheets, and it's the application of all these together that's driving this change. Yes, SolarWinds and security, I can hack that plasma table and make bad brackets for cameras over highways, but that's probably not going to be the problem. The problem may be a ship in the Suez Canal. It may be occlusions in the metal coming from the foundry, right? So it's getting all these attestations that already exist. Between, to your point about the IP control, the partners who are already doing these things. The foundry and the fabrication shop already have a relationship. They have contracts. They're sharing this information now. We find that as we automate it and digitize it, we can have savings on the IP protection space where all you share in an automated fashion is an attestation about a single thing instead of having investigators coming in and asking for all your records, right? So I think we find that we have better IP control, better enunciating the existing relationships and automating business relationships that already exist that just happen to involve cybers.
Cool, thank you. Okay, Tom, so back to SBOMs, because I love SBOMs. I like saying SBOMs. The idea for SBOMs is not new. And in fact, they've been around for a number of years, but we really are kind of coalescing right now and through some of the things that you've been working on, some of the things that NTIA is working on. Why do you think that there's been a delay? Why haven't SBOMs been, widely adopted yet?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. SBOMs are caught in a classic chicken and egg situation. Most large software developers are already producing SBOMs for their internal use, since they're almost always a byproduct of modern development tools. They just produce them automatically. They aren't distributing them, however, because their customers aren't asking for them. Meanwhile, their customers aren't experienced or knowledgeable with using SBOMs to reduce risk, so they aren't asking for them. So this is why the National Technology and Information Administration, or NTIA, of the US Department of Commerce 3 years ago started a proof of concept for use of SBOMs in the healthcare industry. And in the POC, which is ongoing today, although they're in later iterations, but they're still working on this. A small number of hospitals and medical device makers worked out procedures for producing and using SBOMs. They started with a simple use case and have expanded to include more elaborate use cases. And now other industries are starting their own POCs, including autos and electric power. And I'm involved with the power POC. There will likely be POCs for other industries like banking starting in the next year. These proofs of concept have already uncovered important issues that need to be addressed so that SBOMs can be widely used. They all have to do much more with procedures than with technical issues. In fact, the purely technical issues with SBOMs are almost all completely solved. The important point is that the procedural solutions developed in these proofs of concept apply to all industries, not just the one conducting the POC. Now, as more organizations start using SBOMs for risk management, and there are certainly other use cases as well, they'll start requiring them of all their softwares, of all their suppliers. And some companies, of course, already are requiring them. At a certain point, and definitely within 3 years or so, we'll reach the stage where suppliers will compete with each other to provide SBOMs as efficiently as possible, since the users are asking for them.
Yeah.
And Gartner says that by 2024, SBOMs that are regularly updated, because that's important, will be a non-negotiable procurement requirement for over half of enterprise software buyers. And my guess is that's about right. I will also point out that the NTIA volunteers also developed documents discussing aspects of SBOM development, distribution and use, and you can find those on the NTIA website for the Software Transparency Initiative, and it's available at ntia.doc, Department of Commerce.gov/software transparency.
Okay.
And I also have, I'm sorry, I have additional information in my blog post. You can drop me an email or search in my blog under SBOM.
Now, let's come back to that, because I've been, and Tom knows, I've been a religious reader of his blog for a number of years. You actually hit on something I think there that's, well, it's long been one of my hotspots. When I was at NERC, and I would meet with control system vendors and talk to them about security, building security into the products. Kind of the almost universal refrain I got back was, but our customers aren't asking for it. And it's just good to see that the world has shifted a little bit. We're now, the vendors are actually going to be providing this, and I do think in a year or two we're going to see this kind of a wholesale shift in the kind of mentality. So Jennifer, moving on here. So Antero's technology is based on the ability to use artificial intelligence and AI and ML to discover data that we haven't been able to look at before, that we haven't been able to discover before. So talk about how AI addresses supply chain vulnerabilities when it comes to cyber risk in the supply chain and, determining the cyber hygiene, not just of the prime suppliers, but as you say, the N+1 or N-1, N-2, N-N suppliers in the supply chain.
Yep, happy to. And as you're talking and like Chris and Tom are talking about, this is all about, we look at kind of the bill of materials, so the subcomponents that make up the finished good, as well as all of the other relationships. And so the way that we use artificial intelligence and the real power is, like I said a few minutes ago, it's really not detecting the suppliers about, and maybe even the risk in the suppliers about. It's alerting you to the latent risk and the connections that you have that you're unaware of and what's happening in those sub tiers. So, most of us know the suppliers that we're directly handing a check to, right? Our tier ones or our third parties. And we may even have relationships with them where they actually have some societal agreement and self-attestation where they're updating us with different types of information. But you don't really know beyond that. And actually, we did a study not too long ago, about 500 professionals that we just asked, what are you doing around the sub tiers? And 2% looked below the tier one, 2%.
Oh,
And that's, I mean, it wasn't even an AI question. It was just, do you even ask the question? And it was like, wow. And then you have the last 14 months. So it's really about understanding who you're connected to and the nature of those connections, right? Because not all connections are the same level of priority and you need the same hardening and mitigations. Without that, you really have an incomplete picture of your risk exposure as an organization. The interesting thing about AI and why we went this route is that it has no lag, right? Gone are the days of surveys, gone are the days of checking in once a year. It's got no lag to it. So the idea is I want to be able to not just know about things real time, but I want to be able to preempt disruption. If I can understand something's happening in my tier 4 or tier 5 supplier, can I get ahead of it and put mitigations or go to alternatives before I ever get preempted, right? Which goes back to your question of why is this a CEO conversation? It handles large data sets. And when I use the large data sets, now I'm aggregating a lot of information. We bring outside information, publicly available information in, and actually make sense of it in a structured way so that you can actually see the extended supply chain and the monitoring. So, so you get efficiencies, you get the ability to optimize, but more than that, if you think about artificial intelligence, the ability to actually see the extended supply chain, if I'm a cyber professional, it's really much easier for me to use because if I pass CNN or whatever TV show, channel you watch, do we still have channels? And, you see that a breach was announced, you can quickly check that against your extended ecosystem and say, okay, my tier 12 had a problem, and then follow the mapping back to you to figure out where you need to, partner to put mitigations in place. And to me, the non-lagging, the ability to really get a large amount of data so I can get way ahead of any sort of disruption and preempt it, that's really the power that cyber professionals and overall supply chain risk professionals can harness by leveraging artificial intelligence.
beautiful.
I'm a little excited about it, Mark. Sorry.
I can tell. No, well, it is exciting. I mean, like you said, I think you could go to any, as a former CISO, you could ask me who my first tier suppliers were, and I could tell you who they all were. But where did they get their supplies from? I had no idea. So I think that's the value of what you guys are doing.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more, and I don't want to take away from the other guys, but I mean, it's and everybody cares about it. This morning, I was on an interview with the Wall Street Journal about cotton because of the problems that Nike and H&M are having with child labor in China. Now that's part of it. So the conversation's broadened from just security and cyber to cotton. So believe that if you will.
So Chris, let's go back and talk about data again a little bit. Can you describe the difference between how we handle the sharing of supply chain data today and kind of going back to the efficiency thing? How can we do it better? How can we do it more effectively?
Sure. The way we do it today, has worked so far, right? And the reason this is all changing right now is because the direction we're going is more, more data, industrial IoT, the interconnectedness of everything. But we've been doing it with literally things like fax machines and emails, a lot of implicit attestations. You look at the contract language for procurement of software, particularly, and it's not as particular and specific as it should be. So you end up with organizations attesting to each other like this, because I've known Mark for a long time. I trust him. You say something to me, and we have a business relationship. It's probably true. Now that doesn't actually scale and automate going forward. Obviously with keep adding zeros to the number of devices we have and lines of code. So the way to automate that is what you're seeing right here. When you put these pieces together, and Tom's been deeply involved with the software bill of material effort longer than I have. And there's people like Kate Stewart and the SPDX program at Linux Foundation that have 11 years of developing that taxonomy. And you have businesses like Jennifer's who've been brought into this not because it's a neat new area of cybersecurity supply chain, but because business is going this direction, and you need this. You have this sort of situational awareness in all of your other business processes. We just hadn't got around to codifying this. So you see organizations like Interos bringing that business process to it, where Unisys and the DBOM consortium community came in. Was we need a common infrastructure so that all this information can be found in ways that match the need. Because as we find time and time again, after these Stuxnet or the SolarWinds or whatnot, that if you look around, you can find all the attestations are there. They may not be written down the same way, so we need common taxonomies like SBOMs. They may not be organized in business process ways, so we need integrations with business process like Interos. And they've been shared in 1,200 different ways, so we need a common attestation infrastructure like the DBOM node code.
Yep. Great. Thank you. Okay, Tom. So, and this kind of goes to the paranoia of security people, I think, but people are concerned that by publishing and providing transparency around the SBOM, that it will just provide the adversaries with a roadmap for attacking our software. How do you respond to that?
Yeah, well, this objection has been around for a while and probably will be for a while as more and more suppliers are pressured to produce SBOMs. But this concern really doesn't hold water, and for two reasons. The first and the more important one is that it's not too hard for a somewhat knowledgeable user to produce their own SBOM today. I mean, they do it all the time. People do it all the time. The attackers are quite skilled at doing this already, so they've already got SBOMs. They don't really need the supplier to send them one because they have it already. So what's needed is for software users to have the SBOMs as well so that they can plan their defense. The second reason is that mass indiscriminate attacks like WannaCry show that the attacker doesn't need an SBOM.
Yep.
They can distribute, they can attack all they want without having to worry about what components are in there or anything else. So it just really doesn't make much sense to bring this up. It's intuitively, it sounds like it could be a problem, but really it isn't a problem.
Well, we are a paranoid group of people, so.
That's true.
So I can't believe we have just a few minutes left here. I have three more questions, but you have to promise me you only answer them in 60 seconds. Well, maybe 90 seconds. So Jennifer, can you talk a little bit about the need for public-private partnerships when it comes to government agencies moving to protect their assets from these supply chain focused cyber attacks?
Yeah, well, I think the big lead in here, right, or the spoiler, if you will, is the executive order that's out there. I think you have the executive order for supply chain that's coming out with recommendations, and then you have the executive order for cybersecurity that is, there's so much news about it already and it's not even out. And so I think that there's a very forward-leaning posture that the government needs to lead with some of these things. We've been asking, to be very honest with you, agencies have been asking for a kind of an overarching approach from the government for a while. And so I think you're seeing the tipping point under this administration, and we're all anxious to see what those recommendations are. But given the activity that's in the government, if it doesn't include mapping, monitoring, and continuously monitoring your extended supply chain, I'm going to be floored. And then I also think that there's a really big push right now, and you saw it in the COVID relief bill where there was a $10 billion program for CISA and GSA to stand up a collect once and share whole of government approach. You see the DoD trying to do the same thing. So I think you're going to see a big movement across the next couple of fiscal years for a whole of government collect once and share, because there's a lot of redundancy. A lot of the agencies are using all the same suppliers to do what they're doing. And I think that's a benefit to the taxpayers. So I think you have the executive orders, and then you have an undercurrent of this ship's already left with a whole of government approach. And I think those two things will come together over the next 18 to 24 months.
Okay, great. So Chris, leveraging off what Jennifer talked about with the executive order, what are your thoughts about this? How, the two things that everyone is talking about right now is that the EO may require software vendors to notify the federal government customers when they have a breach, which is probably long overdue. But the second is that it may require them to have an SBOM. What are your thoughts on that, on the executive order?
Well, again, if you watch these things over time, you see inevitabilities, and this is coming sooner or later. And given all the events of the last 14 months, not even a year and a half, if you didn't see this coming, and even the previous administration had two executive orders that went down the same path. This is not something really, really new. And we will, so when we find we have to solve something, we find that we can. And I think you can put together the piece of this conversation with Tom. Over time with a standard software bill of materials, the IP control issues, are containable. What we find is that the IP is already spread all over the place. So we'll get better security by actually looking at it and writing it down in common formats and sharing it in common ways for actual business purposes.
Thanks. Yep. Okay, Tom, let's wrap with you. Last question.
Mhm.
And this is important for the audience. How can people get involved with the NTIA Software Transparency Initiative?
Yeah, that's a very good point. The first thing I recommend they do is send an email to Dr. Alan Friedman of the Software Transparency Initiative.
He's going to hate you. He's going to hate you.
No, believe me, he loves getting emails. So, and he responds to them, believe it or not. His email is on that website that I said earlier, but it's also afriedman@ntia.doc.gov. The other thing is to just go to that page, ntia.doc.gov//software transparency, and just look at the stuff that's on there. You'll see signups for these 4 work groups that meet once a week, and they have active email conversations in between. They're doing different things, and you may want to sign up for one of them or all 4 of them, or it doesn't matter. There's no commitment. You can just do what you want. But the point is, you can get involved that way. There are also other videos and presentations on that webpage you can look at. And then plus there's a separate page with documents that have already been produced by the initiative and finalized. And so they're finalized until the next revision comes out. And they're also available on a separate page, which is linked on the main page. So that's how you can get involved, and you can get as involved as you want. It's or
Thanks.
as little as you want. It's up to you.
Well, I have participated in a few of the webinars, and I have been blown away by the level of commitment and the expertise of the people that are volunteering in these programs. It's unbelievable. So I highly encourage everybody to follow Tom's lead there. So, well, we are out of time. I'm going to get the hook here any second now. Thank you for joining. I hope you maybe learned a little bit more about supply chain risk management, DBOM and SBOM, and go look at the NTIA website and volunteer and get involved. Thank you all very much.